Why did the range suddenly feel smaller the moment she lay down behind the rifle? Major David Chun felt it before he understood it. The subtle shift. The way conversations softened. The way seasoned men paused mid-movement without knowing why. The sun over Camp Pendleton was brutal that day, washing the firing line in white heat, but something colder slid down his spine as he watched the woman settle into position. She didn't rush. She didn't perform. She simply arrived. Alexis Morgan adjusted the Barrett with hands that showed no tremor. Not confidence exactly. Something quieter, like familiarity earned the hard way. Chun had seen that look before, on operators who had learned the cost of mistakes long before medals ever entered the picture. Around her the skepticism was unspoken but thick. A woman, no unit patch, oversized rifle, a competition built on reputation and legacy. People like to pretend they judge skill alone, but Chun knew better. He'd lived long enough to recognize disbelief when it wore polite faces. "Who's she aiming at?" someone muttered behind him. The first target sat at 950 meters. Routine. A warm-up distance for men who'd made their names downrange. When the rifle thundered, the sound rolled across the valley like a controlled explosion. Chun followed the trace through his spotting scope. Dead center. Not lucky, not close, precise. Before the range officer could confirm, the second shot landed. Then the third, 3 rounds, 1 hole. A murmur rippled outward. Alexis didn't react. She reloaded, checked her breathing, reset her cheek weld. Like she'd done this 1,000 times before, somewhere far from applause. Chun felt his assumptions begin to crack. Not break, crack. The dangerous kind. The kind that made you realize how much you didn't know. And there was something else, something off. The ammunition. His eyes narrowed. Those rounds weren't standard issue. They were whispers, prototypes, the kind you didn't see unless someone very high up had signed very specific paperwork. "Who are you?" he wondered. "And who made you this way? What kind of person stays calm while everyone else starts unraveling?" As distances stretched past comfort and into theory, the range changed character. At 1,600 meters, experienced snipers began to miss by margins they couldn't explain. At 2,000, frustration crept in. Calculators came out. Wind flags multiplied. Pride started bleeding through discipline. Alexa stayed still. She watched Mirage like it was a language she'd learned young. Her breathing slowed, not from effort but from habit. Chun saw it then. This wasn't competition for her. It was containment, control, a way to keep something dangerous focused. When she fired at 2,400 meters, the delay felt endless. Seconds stretched thin enough to snap. When the confirmation came, it wasn't excitement in the spotter's voice. It was disbelief. Chun glanced at Patterson. The older man's jaw was tight now. This wasn't entertaining anymore. This was unsettling. At 2,800 meters, people stopped whispering. Silence pressed in, heavy and respectful. Alexis held her position for so long Chun wondered if she'd aborted the shot. Then, thunder. Another perfect impact. No smile. No acknowledgement. Just the faintest exhale. Chun realized something then. She wasn't chasing records. She was carrying one. And she was trying very hard not to let anyone see how heavy it was. What kind of past makes a person treat the impossible like routine? After the awards ceremony, Chun approached her carefully, not as a superior, not as an interrogator, as someone who recognized another professional carrying unseen weight. She answered his question simply, too simply: training development command, specialized development, words that explained nothing while sounding official enough to stop further probing. But small things slipped. Mountains, monsoon humidity, extreme elevation corrections, casual references to distances most shooters only discussed hypothetically. Then she mentioned it, almost offhand. A shot, over 3,600 meters. Chun felt the air leave his lungs. That wasn't bravado, that was memory, the kind that stayed with you because it changed something, inside or out. Before he could ask more, the black sedan arrived. Government plates. No urgency, no explanation, just efficiency. Alexis packed quickly. This wasn't her first sudden exit. As she left, she paused, just once. "Some shots," she said quietly, "stay with you longer than others." Then she was gone. And Chun realized the most dangerous operators weren't the loudest ones. They were the ones who learned to disappear. Why would someone with nothing left to prove keep volunteering for the hardest missions? 6 months later, the mountains answered that question. The Colorado Rockies were unforgiving at altitude. Thin air, shifting winds, terrain that punished arrogance. The intelligence briefing was blunt, high-value targets moving beyond conventional engagement range. The math didn't work. Until Alexis stepped into the planning tent. She wore different insignia now, subdued, unfamiliar. Her presence recalibrated the room, not through authority but through quiet certainty. Her overwatch position was brutal, 9 hours of climb, equipment weight that would have broken lesser operators. She didn't complain, didn't perform toughness. She just moved. When the convoy appeared, tiny shapes far below Alexis changed. Focus sharpened, breath slowed, world narrowed. 3,847 meters. Chun watched her through optics as she adjusted for angle, temperature, wind layers stacked like invisible walls. She wasn't just calculating physics. She was accepting consequences. The shot took 4.8 seconds. That's a long time to sit with a decision. When impact confirmed, there was no celebration, no relief, just stillness. Later on the descent, Alexis finally spoke. About the program, the training, the shots that failed before the ones that didn't, the nights replaying decisions no one else would ever know existed. "I'm not proud of the distance," she said quietly. "I'm proud I didn't miss." Chun understood then. This wasn't about records. It was about restraint, about precision as mercy. Some people carried weapons. Others carried responsibility. Alexis carried both. Months later, she was gone again. Another mission, another quiet departure. Her record stayed classified. Her name faded from official memory. But Chun never forgot. Because sometimes strength doesn't announce itself. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did she look so calm when everyone else began to doubt themselves? The farther the targets moved, the more the range began to expose people. At 1,200 meters, confidence still held. At 1,600, it started to thin. By the time the numbers climbed past 2,000, the firing line no longer felt like a competition. It felt like a quiet reckoning. Major David Chun watched it unfold with a familiarity that unsettled him. He had seen this before, not on ranges but in combat zones. The moment when training met reality, and ego began to leak out through missed shots and clenched jaws. Men who had once trusted their hands now stared at their data, recalculating, doubting, adjusting too much. Alexis Morgan didn't belong to that spiral. She lay behind the Barrett as if the distance meant nothing, not because she underestimated it, but because she respected it enough to remain patient. Her breathing settled into a rhythm so steady it seemed disconnected from the tension around her. Chun noticed her fingers, relaxed, not gripping, not forcing control, letting the rifle rest where it wanted to be. The wind shifted, subtle, inconsistent, the kind of wind that humiliated overconfidence. A Marine 2 lanes down cursed softly as his shot drifted wide. An Army Ranger shook his head, frustration breaking through discipline for just a second too long. The range officers exchanged glances. This was where records went to die. Alexis waited. Chun leaned into his spotting scope, curiosity turning into something heavier. Concern, maybe, or recognition, because the longer he watched her, the more he realized she wasn't reading the same information as everyone else. Others read instruments. She read the air. Her eyes tracked heat distortion like a living thing. Mirage wasn't an obstacle to her, it was communication. She didn't rush to break the silence. She let it stretch until the range felt suspended in anticipation. When the Barrett fired, the sound cracked through the valley with authority. Not anger, not aggression, certainty. The bullet took long enough to make people uncomfortable. 3 seconds, then more. Impact. A clean hit. Not perfect center, but intentional, exactly where conditions allowed. Chun exhaled slowly. That wasn't luck, that was restraint. And restraint, he knew, came from experience that had already taught painful lessons. As distances increased, the whispers started. She's calculating too fast. She's not using her kestrel. Is that even allowed ammo? No one said what they were really thinking out loud, because saying it would mean admitting fear. Alexis ignored all of it. At 2,400 meters, the desert heat became a living enemy. Mirage danced so violently it distorted targets into ghosts. This was where shooters began compensating for problems that didn't exist, chasing illusions instead of physics. Alexis didn't chase. She adjusted once, then stopped. Chun felt it again, that instinctive tightening in his chest. The same feeling he'd had moments before an ambush, seconds before something irreversible. Why are you so sure? He wondered. The rifle thundered. The delay felt longer this time. The crowd had learned to wait, but waiting didn't make it easier. When confirmation came, it wasn't applause that followed. It was silence, deep, uncomfortable, respectful. Patterson didn't speak. His skepticism had hardened into something else now, a grudging awareness that the game had changed while he wasn't looking. Alexis reloaded calmly, her expression unchanged. But Chun caught something new in her eyes as she lifted her head, fatigue. Not physical, emotional. The kind that came from constantly being underestimated, from knowing that every success would be followed not by trust, but by suspicion. She wasn't proving herself to them. She was surviving them. At 2,800 meters, several competitors withdrew. Not loudly, not dramatically. Quiet decisions made behind sunglasses and professionalism. No one wanted their name attached to a miss at that distance. Alexa stayed. Her preparation took longer now, not because she doubted, but because she respected the shot enough to give it everything. She adjusted for elevation with microscopic turns, checked the cant twice, then closed her eyes for a brief moment. Chun caught it, that pause. A grounding ritual. Something she did before making decisions that couldn't be undone. When she opened her eyes, the world narrowed. The shot echoed across the range like a verdict. 4.5 seconds passed. Then the spotter's voice cracked, controlled but shaken. Center hit. At that distance, under those conditions, perfection stopped being impressive and started being disturbing. Chun lowered his scope slowly. His pulse hadn't spiked, but his mind raced. No training pipeline produced this by accident. No standard doctrine encouraged this kind of patience, this kind of quiet dominance. This woman wasn't trained to win competitions. She was trained to end things. And that realization carried weight. Afterward, as range staff scrambled to verify data and officials whispered behind clipboards, Alexis sat alone, cleaning her rifle. The ritual was slow, deliberate, as if she needed the familiarity of steel and oil to stay grounded. Chun approached carefully. "Where'd you learn to read wind like that?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. She didn't look up immediately. When she did, her expression held no defensiveness, only caution. "Places where missing meant someone else paid for it," she said. That was all. No elaboration, no pride. Chun nodded. He didn't push, because pushing would have broken something fragile and necessary. As he walked away, he noticed something he hadn't before, a faint scar along her forearm, old, poorly healed, not from training, from consequence. And suddenly, the question wasn't how far she could shoot. It was how much she was carrying, and how long she'd been carrying it alone. Because some records aren't written in numbers. They're written in silence. Why did the applause feel wrong the moment it finally arrived? The sound came late, hesitant at first, then swelling as if the crowd needed permission to react. Applause echoed across the range, clapping against heat and dust and disbelief. It should have felt triumphant. It should have felt earned. Alexis Morgan didn't look up. She stayed seated behind the rifle, methodically breaking it down, her movements precise and unhurried. Applause had never meant safety. Noise had never meant approval. In the world she came from, sound usually meant the opposite. Major David Chun watched her from a distance, unsettled by how disconnected she seemed from the moment she had just created. Records were being rewritten behind her. Careers were quietly recalibrating, and she treated it all like background static. That told him more than the shots ever could. Around her, the competition dissolved into fragments of conversation, arguments about ballistics, murmured theories, thinly veiled resentment. Some tried to explain her away with technology. Others leaned on coincidence. A few simply went quiet, staring downrange as if the desert itself had betrayed them. Patterson finally spoke. His voice carried no edge now. "That wasn't training," he said. "That was conditioning." Chun didn't respond. He was watching Alexis's hands, the way they paused for half a second longer than necessary as she wiped the chamber. Fatigue again, deeper this time. Not physical, never physical. The awards ceremony was formal, clean, almost sterile. Words like historic and unprecedented floated easily through the air. Alexis stood when told, accepted what she was handed, nodded when required. Her posture was correct, but her eyes drifted, scanning exits, angles, people. Still operational. Even here. When it was over, most competitors clustered together, decompressing, laughing too loudly, relief spilling out now that the pressure was gone. Alexis didn't join them. She moved to the edge of the range, sat on a crate and stared at the mountains in the distance. Chun approached her slowly, not because he feared her, but because he respected boundaries. "You ever think about stopping?" he asked. She considered the question, longer than expected. "Sometimes," she said, "but then someone else would have to take the shot." There it was. Responsibility, not glory. He nodded, understanding more than she probably realized. "You don't wear your unit patch." She looked down at her sleeve, then back up. "I don't keep one long enough." That answer lingered between them. They talked in fragments: weather, terrain, the difference between controlled environments and real ones. She spoke like someone who had learned lessons the hard way and never forgotten the cost. Then she mentioned it, almost casually. "There was a longer one," she said, "before today." Chun felt the words before he processed them. How long? Just over 3,600 meters. He didn't hide his reaction. He couldn't. That distance lived in the realm of theory, of miracle shots people debated over drinks, not something you referenced like an old assignment. "When?" he asked. She hesitated, just a flicker, then, "A while ago." That was as close as she came to memory. Before he could ask more, the low hum of an engine cut through the moment. A black sedan rolled onto the gravel, unmarked but unmistakable. Two men stepped out, civilian clothes, government posture. Alexa stood immediately. No surprise, no annoyance, just acceptance. They spoke briefly, quietly, efficiently. Whatever was said required no explanation. She turned back to Chun. "Good luck with the rest of the competition," she said. "That's it?" he asked. She offered the faintest smile. That's always it. She left without ceremony, rifle case in hand, no backward glance. Chun watched the car disappear, unsettled by how easily she vanished, like she had practiced disappearing long before today. 6 months later, the mountains made him understand. The Colorado Rockies didn't forgive mistakes. At over 3,400 meters elevation, the air thinned until thinking felt heavier. Every step reminded you that the margin for error was small and shrinking. The intelligence briefing was blunt: high-value targets, narrow transit window, no close approach possible. The math didn't work. Chun stared at the map, already calculating compromises he didn't like: reduced visibility, extreme distances, wind patterns that shifted by the minute. This was the kind of mission planners hated: too many variables, too little control. Then the convoy arrived. Unmarked, quiet. Alexis stepped out wearing different insignia, muted, unfamiliar. Her presence shifted the tone of the entire briefing room. No announcement, no introduction, just a subtle recalibration as people adjusted around her. She studied the map without comment, then pointed. "Here," she said, "Overwatch." "That's nearly 4,000 meters," someone objected. She nodded. "I know." No argument followed. Something in her certainty shut it down. Preparation took hours. Her gear was unlike anything Chun had seen: custom modifications layered on proven platforms, everything optimized, nothing excessive. That night, as the wind howled across the ridgeline, Chun found her alone, studying satellite imagery. "You don't have to take this one," he said. She didn't look up. "Yes, I do." "Why?" She paused, then quietly, "Because I can." And because if she didn't, someone else would try and fail. The climb to her position took 9 hours. Brutal terrain, thinning air. She never complained, just moved forward one deliberate step at a time. When they finally reached Overwatch, the valley stretched out below them like a living map: tiny roads, smaller vehicles, distance so vast it felt unreal. Alexis lay prone, settling in like she belonged there. When the convoy appeared hours later, she didn't tense, she didn't rush, she waited. The moment came when the primary target stepped out of the vehicle. Her rangefinder read 3,847 meters. Chun watched her breathing slow, watched the world narrow around her. The shot took 4.8 seconds. That's a long time to live with a decision. When impact confirmed, there was no reaction, no release, just stillness. Later on the descent, she finally spoke. "They train us to be precise," she said, "but they don't train us to carry it afterward." Chun didn't respond. There was nothing to add. Some burdens weren't meant to be shared. Some were simply endured. What happens after the impossible becomes routine? The mountain was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, as if the valley itself was holding its breath. Snow clung to shadowed ridgelines, unmoving, indifferent to what had just taken place. The shot was already over, its echo long gone, but its weight lingered in the thin air like something unfinished. Alexis Morgan lay still behind the rifle, long after confirmation came through the radio. Not frozen, not shaken, just present. Major David Chun watched her through peripheral vision, careful not to intrude on the moment. He had seen this stillness before, on men after firefights, after decisions that closed doors permanently. The world continued, but something inside them lagged behind, catching up at its own pace. Eventually, Alexis exhaled. She reached forward and engaged the safety with deliberate care, not because the rifle was dangerous anymore, but because ritual mattered. Ritual kept chaos from creeping in. The team didn't celebrate, they didn't speak much at all. Success at that distance didn't feel victorious. It felt heavy, clinical, necessary. As they began the long descent, the strain finally surfaced. not in her legs, but in the quiet between steps. Alexis moved steadily, but Chun noticed the way her shoulders sagged when she thought no one was watching. The cost always arrived late. Halfway down the mountain, she stopped. Just for a moment. Chun waited. "I still see the numbers," she said quietly. "Afterward." He didn't ask what numbers, he knew. Distance, wind, time. Variables that refused to stay on the mountain. "They don't turn off," she continued. "Not right away." He nodded. "They never do." She looked at him then, not for reassurance but for understanding. When she found it, something in her posture softened. At base camp, the debrief was efficient and emotionless, the kind of language that turned human decisions into bullet points. The shot was recorded, the distance noted, conditions logged. 3,847 meters. It went into a file that few people would ever see, a number stripped of context, of effort, of consequence. Alexis said nothing during the debrief. She signed where indicated, listened when required. Her eyes never lingered on the screen displaying the data. Later that night, as the camp settled into uneasy rest, Chun found her alone near the perimeter, staring out into darkness. "You could have walked away after today," he said. "No one would have blamed you." She considered that, really considered it. "I've walked away before," she said. "It doesn't follow you out." That answer stayed with him. She spoke more that night than she ever had before. Not details, never details, but fragments. About training facilities that didn't exist on maps. About instructors who taught patience before precision. About days spent firing single rounds, then waiting hours before being told whether they'd been right. "Missing wasn't failure," she said. "Missing meant you weren't ready." "And when you were ready?" Chun asked. She hesitated. "Then you stopped thinking about yourself." That was the core of it. Self had no place at those distances. Alexis didn't talk about fear, but Chun sensed it, not as panic but as respect. The kind that keeps you careful, the kind that keeps you alive long enough to carry guilt instead of regret. She left 3 days later. No announcement, no farewell briefing, just a quiet transfer of responsibility back to the mountain and the men who remained. Her departure was efficient, familiar. As the helicopter lifted away, Chun felt an unexpected hollowness. Not loss, but absence. Like something rare had passed through his life briefly and left no proof it had ever been there. Weeks turned into months. Back home, life resumed its predictable rhythm. Meetings, reports, training cycles. Yet sometimes, in the middle of ordinary moments, Chun found his thoughts drifting back to that valley. To the pause before the shot. To the discipline it took not to rush something irreversible. Rumors surfaced occasionally. Whispers passed between people who knew how to listen. Stories of impossible engagements in remote regions. Shots taken from distances that didn't make sense on paper. No names were attached. He never asked. Because knowing would have changed nothing. One evening, while reviewing after-action reports, Chun paused over a familiar phrasing. Precision engagement, extreme range, favorable outcome. He closed the file. Language like that never captured truth. The truth was quieter. The truth was a woman lying alone on cold stone, choosing patience over urgency, responsibility over recognition, choosing to act without being seen. Months later, a package arrived at Chun's office. No return address. Inside was a single spent .50 caliber casing, polished smooth. Etched near the base was a number. 3,847. Nothing else. No note, no explanation. He held it for a long time. Not as a trophy. As a reminder. That the most extraordinary strength often moves without witnesses. That records can disappear into classified archives, but character leaves impressions that last. Some people make history loudly. Others make it quietly and live with the echo long after the sound fades. And sometimes, the bravest thing a person can do is carry the weight without asking anyone to notice. Why did the world feel louder after she disappeared? Major David Chun noticed it first in the quiet moments, the kind that crept in between briefings, between routine conversations that no longer held his attention. The mountains were behind him now, the mission officially closed, filed away under language so clean it bordered on dishonest. Life moved forward the way it always did. But something in him lagged behind. Alexis Morgan was gone, not transferred, not reassigned in any way that could be tracked, simply absent, as if the system itself had inhaled and erased her footprint. For weeks Chun expected to hear her name spoken aloud. It never was. Instead, there were whispers, fragmented reports drifting through unofficial channels, a convoy neutralized at an impossible distance in terrain no drone could reach, a single-shot engagement that prevented a firefight no one else ever knew had been avoided. No names, no confirmation, just numbers that made experienced planners go quiet. Chun learned to recognize the pattern. He would read a report, pause at a familiar phrasing, and feel the same tightness settle behind his ribs. Precision engagement, extreme range, favorable outcome. She was still out there, and that realization carried its own kind of unease. One evening, long after the base had emptied, Chun stayed behind reviewing training evaluations. Young snipers, talented, confident, hungry. He listened to their language, how they talked about distance like a challenge, about targets like abstractions. He wondered how long it would take before reality stripped that tone from them. Alexis had never spoken like that. She had spoken like someone who already knew what success cost. Weeks later, he was asked to guest lecture a small advanced marksmanship class. He didn't prepare slides, didn't bring charts. Instead, he told them a story. Not about Alexis, not about records. He spoke about waiting, about choosing not to shoot until you were absolutely certain, not because you might miss, but because you might be right. He watched their expressions shift as the idea landed uncomfortably. One student asked, "How do you know when you're ready?" Chun paused. "When you stop thinking about what it'll make you," he said, "and start thinking about what it'll take from you." The room went quiet. That night Chun dreamed of the valley again, not the shot, but the silence afterward, the way Alexis had stayed still, as if motion itself might fracture something fragile. When he woke, he realized something unsettling. Alexis wasn't haunted by what she had done. She was burdened by how easily she could do it. The difference mattered. Months passed. Then came the call. Not official, not direct, just a quiet request to consult on a feasibility problem. A map slid across a table, distances marked that edged toward absurd. "This isn't workable," someone said, "not without unacceptable risk." Chun studied the terrain, the elevation, the wind corridors. "It is," he said finally, "but not for most people." They didn't ask him to explain. They didn't need to. The mission went ahead, outcome favorable, details classified. Chun didn't ask who took the shot. He already knew. Late one night, as rain tapped softly against his office window, Chun found himself wondering something he'd avoided until now. How long could someone live like that? How many impossible decisions could one person carry before something gave way? Alexis had once said the numbers didn't turn off right away. He suspected they never did, that every distance stacked on the last, every calculation another layer of weight. And yet she kept going. Not because she was fearless, but because she believed someone had to. A year passed before Chun saw her again. Not in person. In reflection. A classified briefing flickered across a screen during a joint symposium. Footage paused on a ridgeline silhouette, barely discernible, grainy, distant. A single frame. Alexis prone, still, waiting. The presenter moved on quickly. The image vanished. But Chun sat frozen. Because in that stillness, he recognized the same posture, the same quiet defiance against urgency, the same acceptance of consequence. After the session, he stood alone in the hallway longer than necessary. People passed. Conversations overlapped. He realized something then, something that unsettled him more than any shot ever had. Alexis wasn't exceptional because she broke records. She was exceptional because she never tried to escape what those records meant. She didn't chase distance. She endured it. And endurance, Chun knew, was a finite resource. That night he wrote a letter he never sent. No address, no name, just thoughts he needed somewhere outside his head. "I hope you're finding moments of quiet," he wrote. Not silence, but quiet. The kind that lets you remember who you were before the numbers. He folded the paper and placed it in a drawer. Some messages weren't meant to be delivered. They were meant to be carried. Because the strongest people rarely ask for relief. They just keep walking forward, trusting that someone, somewhere, understands the weight, even if they never say it out loud. Why do some legends fade quietly, while others never truly leave? Years later, Major David Chun would struggle to pinpoint the exact moment he realized Alexis Morgan was done. Not reassigned, not lost, just finished. The signs were subtle. No new whispers, no strange reports brushing the edge of plausibility, no impossible numbers slipping through classified language. Silence. At first he told himself it meant nothing. Operations ebbed and flowed. The world never stopped producing crises that demanded precision. But as months turned into years, the pattern hardened into absence. Alexis Morgan no longer appeared between the lines. Chun retired not long after. Official ceremonies, handshakes, commendations polished smooth by repetition. He accepted them with grace, but something in him remained unfinished. War had shaped his life, but it hadn't defined its meaning. People had. One of them had passed through like a shadow and altered his understanding forever. Retirement gave him time, too much of it at first. Mornings stretched longer. Silence filled spaces once occupied by urgency. He found himself hiking more, choosing elevation over comfort, drawn back to thin air where thinking slowed and memories sharpened. On one such hike, standing alone on a ridgeline as wind curled around him, it finally surfaced. Alexis had never been chasing distance. She had been chasing certainty. Certainty that the shot was necessary. Certainty that waiting longer wouldn't save more lives. Certainty that if the trigger broke, it was because every other option had already failed. That kind of certainty didn't come from confidence. It came from moral exhaustion. Chun realized then why she had never celebrated, why she had never spoken of pride, why records had meant nothing to her. Each impossible shot wasn't a triumph. It was evidence that the world had once again reached a point where only extremes remained. Years later, at a quiet symposium on the ethics of long-range warfare, Chun was invited to speak, not as a tactician, but as a witness. He stood at the podium longer than expected, hands resting lightly on the wood, eyes scanning a room filled with younger faces. Analysts, officers, thinkers. They wanted frameworks, doctrine, clean answers. He gave them none of that. Instead, he told them about waiting. About a woman who could read wind the way others read language. About a person who understood that the farther the distance, the heavier the responsibility. About silence, not as absence but as restraint. He never said her name. He didn't need to. Afterward, a young officer approached him. "Sir," she said carefully, "do you think someone like that can ever really stop?" Chun considered the question. Yes, he said finally, but stopping isn't rest. It's just choosing a different weight to carry. That night, alone in his home, Chun opened the drawer where the spent casing still rested. The number etched into its base had softened with time, worn by countless moments of contemplation. 3847. He placed it back gently, not as a relic, as a reminder. He imagined Alexis somewhere far from ranges and ridgelines, maybe teaching, maybe walking quietly through ordinary days, or maybe simply learning how to exist without the constant hum of calculations. He hoped, truly hoped, that she had found quiet. Not peace, peace was too much to ask. But quiet, because quiet left room for humanity. Years later still, a declassified journal article circulated briefly before disappearing behind permissions and redactions. It spoke abstractly about the limits of human precision, about how extreme-range engagements depended less on technology than on judgment, about the unseen cost borne by the individual who made the final decision. There was a single line near the end, almost an afterthought. The most effective operators were not those who could shoot the farthest, but those who knew when not to. Chun read it once, then again. He smiled, not with pride but with recognition. Somewhere, someone had finally understood. Alexis Morgan would never have a statue. Her name wouldn't anchor textbooks. Her record would remain hidden behind layers of classification and convenience. And that was exactly how she would have wanted it. Because the truth was never about how far the bullet traveled. It was about how far a person was willing to carry the weight of their actions and still choose restraint over impulse. Some strength announces itself. Some strength endures quietly. And sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.